So today we're talking about domain and range. And I know that we talked a little bit about domain and range in the review activity, where we just stated it on a line from one endpoint to the other, where both endpoints were included in the domain and range. So before we get to today's lesson for the activity, let's recall that the domain represents all the x values of a function, and the range represents all y values of a function. So if we start by looking at a graph where we simply have 4 points plotted on a coordinate plane, and I asked you to write the domain of these points, we would just simply list all of the x values. So we're going to look at each point from the left side of the graph to the right side of the graph, because we always want to state both domain and range from the lowest value to the highest value. So for the x-axis, that's going to be from the left to the right, because the left side numbers are our negative numbers, and those are our smaller values to the left. So the first point we have here is w, and that is 1 for the x value. Then we have z, which is 2. And then we have 2 points that both lie at 4 on the x-axis. So the x values of the points plotted here on this coordinate plane are 1, 2, and 4. So we're going to write our domain simply as 1, 2, and 4. So for the range, we're going to do the exact same thing, but now we're listing the y values. And we're again going to list them from the smallest value to the largest value. So on the y-axis, that's going to be from the bottommost point to the topmost point. So y is our smallest point at 1, x is at 2, z is at 4, and w is at 5. So we will list our range as 1, 2, 4, and 5. Now, if we take a look at this circle here that has been graphed in the coordinate plane, and we look to write the domain and range, the domain is again going to be written from the left side of the graph to the right side of the graph. So what we want to do is identify the leftmost value of x. So if I were to draw a line that was on the very left side of the circle, that would be here at -1. And if I were to draw a line on the very right side of the circle, that would be here at +3. So as you can see, our circle exists at -1, at 0, at 1, at 2, and at 3. But what you'll also notice is that we have a circle that is continuous, that is also graphed in between all of those values. So the circle exists from -1 all the way to 0, from 0 all the way to +1, from +1 to +2, and from +2 to +3, and then all the way back around. So what we have to keep in mind is that the graph also exists between those values. Now, it's not possible for us to, and if you can see at the bottom, I've also circled the numbers in between -1 and 0. And it isn't possible for us to go through and to list every single value that's between -1 and 0. It's all of those different fractional values. There's 1/8, 1/4, 1/2, et cetera, et cetera. And we could keep breaking those numbers down infinitely smaller to a bunch of numbers in between two whole numbers. And so that is why we write our domain as an inequality, because our circle exists everywhere from -1 to +3. Now, -1 is part of our circle because our circle touches at -1 and our circle touches at +3. So when we write that inequality, we're going to say -1 is less than or equal to x, which is less than or equal to +3. So the reason we use those equal to symbols, again, is because our circle is touching at -1 and it is touching at +3. And we'll talk in a little bit about what happens when our graph does not touch at those endpoints. So that is our inequality notation because it contains the inequalities within the statement. Now, there's another notation, which you're probably familiar with from Math 1, that's called interval notation. And interval notation uses what we call brackets, which if you look on your keyboard are just under the backspace button and off to the left a little bit. And they're the bottom ones that we're going to use. But we'll also use parentheses, and those are used for different things. So for this specific domain, because the graph does touch at -1 and does touch at +3, that is when we're going to use the brackets around our numbers. Now, the thing about using interval notation is that we don't use a variable within the notation. And so what's a good idea to do is to write the variable with a colon, just like you did up here with the domain for inequality notation, just to indicate whether you're talking about the domain or the range, because again, the variable is not listed within the interval notation. So for the domain for this one, we still use the same endpoints, the -1 and the 3, but we just simply put them inside of the brackets, separating them with a comma. So our graph goes from -1 to +3 on the x-axis. So for the range, what we want to do is find the smallest y value all the way to the largest y value. So the very bottom of our graph is here, where y equals 0, and the very top of our graph is here, where y equals 4. So just like what we did with the domain, we started our smallest value, which is going to be 0, is less than or equal to, now that we're talking about the range, it's going to be y, which is less than or equal to +4. Now taking that and writing it in interval notation, our graph still exists at 0 and it still exists at 4 because it touches at those two values. So we're going to use brackets around those endpoints at 0 and 4. So it's going to be 0, 4. But again, you'll want to write that y colon out in front just so that we know whether you're talking about the x values or the y values or the domain or range. So on this graph here, we're doing the exact same thing. If we're talking about the domain, that's the left side of the graph to the right side of the graph. So our left side is here at -3. The right side is here at +5. Now our graph is touching at both of those values, so it's going to be equal to at both of those values. So in inequality notation, that's going to be -3, less than or equal to x, less than or equal to +5. And in interval notation, still using the brackets, -3, 5. For the range, that's the very bottom of the graph, which is here at -3. The very top of the graph, which is here at +1. So our range is going to be -3, less than or equal to y, less than or equal to +1. And in interval notation, using those brackets because our graph touches at both of those values, we have -3 and 1 separated by a comma. All right, so now this looks similar to the domain and range that we were writing in the review lesson. Only now, if you look at the line that we have here, you'll notice that the left-hand endpoint has an open circle or a hole. So given that it has that open circle or the hole, that's going to change things up a little bit because technically our line is not touching at that value. And so when we write our domain and our range in inequality notation, we're not going to use the equal to under our inequality symbol. So if we start with domain, we want to write it from the left side of the graph to the right side of the graph. So the left side of the line is here, and that's our x value that we're looking at because it's domain, and the x value at this point is -2. All the way to the right-hand side of our graph, which is here, and the x value at that point is +4. So if we write our domain from the left side, it's going to be -2 is less than, but not equal to. Do not use the underline under your inequality symbol. Less than x is less than or equal to +4 because that right-hand endpoint does have the solid circle. So our graph, our line is touching at that x value. So -2 less than x less than or equal to +4. And again, we don't have that underline under this inequality symbol because the graph has a hole or an open circle at -2. So now what changes in interval notation is that we don't use the bracket because the bracket indicates that the graph is touching at that number. So we will use the bracket on the side with the 4, but not on the side with the -2. So instead of the bracket, we use the parentheses. So basically, all that we do is that when it's not equal to, we use the parentheses, and when it is equal to, we use the bracket. So in interval notation, it's an open parentheses, -2, separated with a comma, 4, and then with the bracket at the end because it's equal to. Same thing for the range, going from the bottom of the graph to the top of the graph. So the bottommost point is here, and the y value, because it's range, is at -7, all the way to the top of the graph, which is here, and its y value is +5. Now, still keeping in mind that that bottom point is a whole, it is not going to be equal to at that point either. So for the range, starting at the bottom, is going to be -7 less than y less than or equal to +5. And then the same rules apply when going from an inequality to interval notation, where the parenthesis is going to be used with the -7 because it's not equal to, and the bracket will be used with +5 because it is equal to. All right, so starting with domain, left side again, x value is at -3. All the way to the right-hand side, which is here, which is a whole, keep that in mind, whose x value is +2. So when writing the domain, we're going from -3 to +2. At -3, it will be equal to because it's a solid circle. And at +2, it will not be equal to because it's a whole. So -3 is less than or equal to x, which is less than +2. Taking that and changing it to interval notation, where we have it is equal to at -3, we're going to use a bracket. Where it is not equal to at +2, we will use a parenthesis. So -3 and 2 separated with a comma for our interval notation. Now for the range is the very bottom of the graph, which is here at -3, all the way to the top of our graph, which is here at +6. Now you're always going to go to the topmost point. So even though this side of the graph ends at this point, on this side of the graph, it continues to go upwards, where all of these y values are still included. So we have to go to the very top of the graph, which in this case is +6. So the range is from -3 all the way to +6, and our graph is touching at -3, so that is going to be equal to, and it's a solid circle at +6, so that will be equal to as well. So for the range, it's going to be -3 less than or equal to y less than or equal to +6. And because these are both equal to, when we change this to interval notation, we're going to use two brackets. So -3 and 6 separated with a comma with two brackets because both of them are equal to. All right, so now it's going to get a little bit tricky. So notice that we have those arrows at the end of at the ends of each graph. So what the arrows are telling us is that our graph is going to continue on forever and ever and ever, which we call in math infinity. Now, still using the same rules where the domain is from the left side all the way to the right side, and the range is from the very bottom all the way to the top. With the arrows, there really is no left side because it's infinite. It goes on forever to the left. It goes on forever to the right. So this right here is going to continue on all the way to the left, all the way to -infinity. Now, it gets a little bit confusing because, yes, I know that these are pointing up, but also notice that they're also going slowly to the left and slowly to the right. So when you have those arrows, it's going to go to infinity. So the left side of the graph is going all the way to -infinity, and the right side of the graph is going all the way to positive infinity. So I can't really draw a line at the left and the right side of the graph because it goes on forever. So we use infinity in our domain. So the very left side of our graph is at negative infinity, and the very right side of our graph is at positive infinity. Now, the thing about infinity is that it's not an actual number. It represents a whole bunch of numbers. So we can't say that our graph is actually equal to at infinity. So when we use infinity in our inequality notation or in our interval notation, our graph is not equal to at those values. So you make sure you don't use the equal to symbol in your inequality and that you're using a parenthesis when you do your interval notation. So for the domain, it's going to be negative infinity is less than x is less than positive infinity. And again, we're not going to be equal to at infinity. So for interval notation, because it's not equal to, we will use two parentheses separated by a comma. Now for the range, bottom of the graph is here at -4, and the top of the graph is going up forever, all the way to positive infinity. So the range is from -4 all the way to positive infinity. Now our graph does touch at -4, so when we use -4 in our range, we do have to say equal to. So -4 is less than or equal to y is less than positive infinity. And then taking that and writing it in interval notation, because our graph is equal to at -4, we will use a bracket, and it is not equal to at infinity, we will use a parentheses. So let's do this again. Left side very slowly goes to negative infinity, and the right side very slowly goes to positive infinity. So negative infinity is less than x is less than positive infinity. And in interval notation, because we did not say equal to, we use parentheses on both sides. For the range, the very bottom of the graph, well, now notice that this parabola is facing downwards. And it's going down infinitely. So the bottom of our graph is all the way down to negative infinity. And the top of our graph is here at +7. So for the range, negative infinity is less than, y is less than or equal to, because our graph is touching at +7, +7. When we write in interval notation, over here at negative infinity, it's not equal to, so we use a parentheses, and over here it is equal to, so we will use a bracket. Now here we have a line. We have no endpoints. This is indicating that our line goes down and to the left infinitely and up and to the right infinitely. So if we go for the domain first from left side to right side, the left side of our graph is going all the way to negative infinity. The right side of our graph is going all the way to positive infinity. So for the domain, negative infinity is less than x is less than positive infinity. In interval notation, we're going to use parentheses because it is not equal to at either of those values. And then for the range, bottom of the graph goes all the way to negative infinity, and top of the graph goes all the way to positive infinity. So the range happens to be the same here, only now we're talking about y. So negative infinity is less than y is less than infinity. And again, we'll use parentheses because it is not equal to at either of those values. So that is domain and range in both inequality notation and interval notation. And so on the activity, Feel free to draw your own lines or circles onto the graphs so that you can see where the very left side, very right side, very bottom, and very top of your graphs are.